Welcome back, everyone. Today we're gonna be making a winter hat, also known as a beanie. And I have made a video for this in the past, but I'm gonna be introducing a new pattern that you can use with all sorts of fabrics. Because the biggest thing is when it comes to making these hats is using the correct fabric. So I'm gonna go into details on the fabric choices and how to work with the fabric you have to make the right fitting hat. Other than that, this is a super easy sewing project that you can make a ton of these really quick. So if you are doing a sewing, you should have no problem following the detailed step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you'll need 1/4 to a 1/2 yard for your main fabric. I recommend using a very stretchy rib knit fabric if you can find it. This type of fabric is very hard to find in the right stretch. That's why I split this pattern up into different sizes so you can use the correct size with the correct stretch fabric. On the pattern, there is a ruler where you can test the stretch of your fabric. And what I did is cut out a 2-inch width square, held it down to the ruler at 0 and see how far I could stretch it. And I tested this on most of my stretchy fabrics. I came to the conclusion that anything under 3 inches is not that stretchy and anything over 5 inches is very stretchy. If your fabric falls in that section, I recommend using the medium stretch pattern. Anything under, use the light stretch pattern, and anything over 5, use the high stretch pattern. And again, this isn't perfect science because all fabrics do act differently and they stretch differently, so you may have to play around with it to get that perfect fit out of your fabric. But using the spectrum of sizes I provide in the pattern, you will be able to dial it in from there. And another quick thing to keep in mind is the thickness of the fabric. This also plays in the role in what size to use. If your fabric is very thick, then a smaller size, it's gonna end up being super small and it's not gonna probably stretch and fit over your head. So this is one more small thing to keep in mind as you're sewing. And that's why I always recommend grabbing a little bit more of the fabric you're using so you can play around with it and find that sweet spot. And before we get started, don't forget to grab that PDF pattern. The pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it off, tape it together, and you're ready to go. Before you tape it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. For the best results, I highly recommend checking your printer alignment. To get this pattern to fit right, you really need to figure out the stretch of your fabric and use that stretch to pick the correct size pattern. And I will say it's not like a one and done size pattern. Different fabrics work differently and they stretch differently. So you'll definitely want to study your fabric a little bit before you cut your panel out. And from here, we're going to cut the pattern on the outside of the black line. After cutting out your fabric, you should end up with one main panel cut on the fold. So when you open this panel up, it should be perfectly symmetrical on both sides of that center fold. And before we get started with sewing, I want to quickly show you how you can adjust this pattern to make it a little bit taller or a little bit shorter. Locate the adjust at center box on the pattern and cut directly down the center guide. And it's super simple. All you have to do is slide the panels together to get a shorter beanie, something more along the lines of a watchman cap, or slide the panels apart, tape some paper in the center, and it's gonna be taller. Moving on to construction, grab the main panel, and the first thing we're gonna do is lay the fabric out and place the right sides together. But before we get too far, it's really important to make sure the stretch is going in the correct direction. If everything checks out, then we're gonna locate the side mark guides on the pattern, and these are gonna be the dashed lines on the outside edges. And essentially what we want to do is make those marks on the outside edges of our fabric. If you adjusted the height like we talked about, just line up the points of the pattern with the points of your fabric. Quickly double check to make sure the points are directly across from one another. Locate the side seam guide on the pattern. It's going to be the edge opposite of the fold. Using the markings we just made, we're going to be sewing that side seam from one side mark to the opposite side mark. And real quickly before we get into sewing, we're going to be using a serger for this project. These are super great for knit fabrics. They allow you to sew stretchy fabrics without breaking the thread. And another great thing, they also cut and clean up that edge as you're sewing. All in all, giving you a more professional look. But if you don't have a serger, that's totally fine. You can still use your regular domestic sewing machine. All you have to do is switch your machine to a zigzag stitch, adjust the height and width to your preference, and this is going to allow that thread to stretch with the fabric. Both of these methods work great. It's just something to keep in mind if you plan on selling these. Sometimes working with these knit fabrics, I find it's hard to get that perfect cut. So that's why I like working with the serger, because it's going to cut and clean up that edge edge, and essentially leave me with a nicer looking product. After finishing off the stitch, quickly check and see if both of the layers got stitched together. Sometimes part of the edge slips out, so it's nice to check this before you get too far. Next we'll be sewing the top peak seams, and I found the best way to do this is to pinch the fabric directly in the center of that peak and pull upwards. This will put the side seam directly in the center of the panel, and then from here we're going to line up the outside edges. And what we did is push those edges that we needed to sew first to the outside. Remember, we're stitching at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to be spinning around and doing the same stitch on the opposite side. Using this technique, you can make a ton of beanies super quick. After finishing off all the seams, we're going to double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together. Spin it towards one of the ends and just check to see if the center seams line up or if they're fairly close, or as close as possible, because the more symmetrical this hat is, the better it's going to fit on your head. Anyways, moving on from here, we're going to roll the hat in half with the wrong sides together so the right side is facing out. And what we're trying to do is fold it exactly in half so everything lines up at the top. And I found the easiest way to finish off that top edge was to line up all the seams directly in the center. Line up both of the side seams, the folded edge and the seamed edge. If done correctly, they should be fairly parallel to each other. With everything lined up, we're going to stitch that top edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Depending on what type of fabric you used, it can be very bulky, so take your time and use the correct needles. With the serge complete, it's best to double check to make sure all those layers got stitched together, because when you're working with 4 layers like this, it's easy for one part to slip out and then you have an opening when you flip it right sides back out. But if everything is looking good and all the layers are stitched together, we're going to flip the right sides out. And that's going to do it for the sewing portion of this project. From here, what we're going to do is roll that bottom edge up. And this is totally up to you and preference on how high you want to roll it. And the standard pattern length allows for a couple inches of roll. If you want more or less, you might have to adjust the pattern. The final step is adding our branding. And when it comes to adding the branding, if you're adding embroidery, you really want to stretch it, because if you add it without it stretched and you try to put it on, it's going to fit really weird. So just keep that in mind. That's why I added mine with 1 rivet, so that way when I stretch it, it doesn't affect the fit. But get crazy with it, try a bunch of different fabrics, find something that's going to work for you. I like to recycle a bunch of my old fabrics, so that way nothing goes to waste. And like I said before, but it's really important to note that each fabric is going to work differently, and you really have to fine tune the pattern to work with the fabric you have. Some fabrics are really thick and chunky, so when you roll that bottom edge up, it's going to be really huge. You want to keep that in mind when you're picking out your fabrics. Also, the height plays a huge difference. If you want that really tiny beanie, then you want to adjust the height. But with all the patterns included in this one download, you should be able to dial it in for every style of fabric. And the most important thing is that you're making this custom, so you can make it to whatever size you want, so you might as well make it fit right. And who knows, you might even come across the next big fabric to use in beanie making. And there you go, your winter hat is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. And if you're using a fabric outside the rib knit fabric, it may take a little bit to dial in that perfect fit, but I promise you, with the way I split this pattern up, you should be able to find it within that spectrum. It just takes a little bit of time and patience, but eventually you will lock it in. Like always, tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing. I love to see how your work turns out, but other than that, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.